The phone rang at 6:17 on a rainy Tuesday morning. Richard Bennett almost ignored it. At 69 years old, he had learned that unexpected calls rarely brought good news. Usually, they were telemarketers, hospital reminders, or someone trying to sell him something he didn't need. But something made him stop as he reached for his coffee. The number was unfamiliar. He answered, "Mr. Richard Bennett?" A woman's voice, calm, careful. "Yes." There was a pause. Then she said something that made his heart stop. "I think you may be my father." For a moment, Richard couldn't breathe. The coffee mug slipped from his hand and shattered across the kitchen floor. Rain tapped against the windows as silence filled the room. "This has to be a mistake," he finally whispered. The woman didn't argue. "I thought so too," she said softly. For most of my life, Richard lowered himself into a chair. His hands were shaking, because there was only one person she could possibly be talking about. Only one chapter of his life he had spent nearly 50 years trying to forget. And suddenly, it was standing at his front door again. Richard lived alone in a small house outside Columbus, Ohio. His wife, Margaret, had passed away 6 years earlier after a long battle with cancer. His son lived 3 states away and called only occasionally. Most days followed the same routine. Coffee, morning walk, television, dinner, sleep, repeat. It wasn't a bad life. It was simply a quiet one. But there was one memory that still visited him at night. A memory from 1977. Richard was 20 years old then. Young, stubborn, certain he understood the world. He had fallen in love with a girl named Susan Harper. She had bright eyes, a loud laugh, and dreams much bigger than their small town. For 2 years, they were inseparable. Everyone assumed they would get married. Richard assumed it too. Until everything fell apart. Arguments became constant. Money became a problem. Their futures no longer seemed to fit together. Then one night, after a terrible fight, Susan left. No goodbye. No explanation. Just gone. A month later, Richard heard she had moved across the country. After that, life continued. Or at least he told himself it did. Years later he met Margaret. Built a family. Started a career. Moved on. But occasionally he wondered what had happened to Susan. Whether she had found happiness. Whether she ever thought about him. Then eventually, even those questions faded. Or so he believed. "How did you get this number?" Richard asked. The woman on the phone hesitated. "It took years. Years. My mother died 8 months ago." Richard felt a chill. "Susan?" It had to be Susan. The woman continued. "While going through her things, I found letters. Old photographs. Documents." Richard closed his eyes. The memories were arriving faster now. Painful. Sharp. Impossible to stop. "What is your name?" he asked quietly. Another pause. "Emily." The name meant nothing to him. Yet somehow it felt strangely familiar. "I'm 48 years old," she said. Richard's heart pounded. 48. He did the math instantly. The years matched. Exactly. Perfectly. A terrible possibility began forming in his mind. "No," he whispered. Emily's voice trembled. "My mother never told me who my father was." Richard gripped the edge of the table. The room suddenly felt smaller. "I found your name in her belongings." Neither spoke. The silence between them carried decades of unanswered questions. Finally, Richard asked the question he was afraid to hear. "Are you saying Susan was pregnant when she left?" A long breath came through the phone. "Yes." The word hit him harder than he expected. Yes. One simple word. One lifetime of consequences. Richard stared out the rain-covered window. All those years. All those birthdays. All those Christmas mornings. All those milestones. Gone. Not because he chose to leave. Because he never knew. Or at least, that's what he believed. But another thought entered his mind. A darker one. What if Susan had tried to tell him? What if a letter had been lost? What if he had missed some sign? What if the biggest mistake of his life wasn't what he did, but what he failed to do? 2 days later, Emily asked if they could meet. Richard almost said no. Not because he didn't want answers. Because he wasn't sure he deserved them. How do you become a father to someone who spent nearly 50 years without you? How do you explain an absence that lasted longer than some marriages? Yet something deep inside him knew he couldn't walk away. Not this time. so they arranged to meet at a small diner halfway between their towns. Friday afternoon, 3 o'clock. Simple, neutral, safe. At least that's what Richard told himself. But the night before the meeting, he couldn't sleep. He sat in his living room, staring at an old photograph of himself at 20. Young, confident, completely unaware of the life waiting around the corner. Then, just before midnight, his phone buzzed. A text message from Emily. Only one sentence. And after reading it, Richard felt the blood drain from his face. Because the message said, "Before tomorrow, there's something important you need to know about my mother." And beneath it was an old scanned letter. A letter dated 1977. Addressed to Richard. A letter he had never seen before. And what it revealed threatened to change everything he believed about the past. Richard stared at the screen long after the message arrived. His hands trembled as he opened the scanned letter. The paper was yellowed with age. The handwriting was unmistakable. Susan's. For a moment, he was 20 years old again, standing outside her apartment, hearing her laugh, believing they had forever. Then he began to read. "Richard, if you're reading this, then I finally found the courage to tell you the truth. I'm pregnant." Richard's chest tightened. Even after hearing Emily say it, seeing the words written in Susan's own hand felt different. More real. More painful. He continued reading. "I wanted to tell you face to face, but every time I tried, we ended up fighting. Maybe I'm scared. Maybe you're scared too. But you deserve to know." The words blurred as tears filled his eyes. He wiped them away and kept reading. "I don't know what happens next. I don't know if we'll stay together. I don't know if you'll even want this child. But I couldn't leave without telling you." Richard stopped. His breathing became shallow. Because the letter was proof. Susan had tried. She had tried to tell him. And somehow, the message never reached him. The next paragraph hit even harder. "If you don't answer, I'll assume you've made your choice, and I'll raise this baby on my own." Richard closed his eyes. For nearly 50 years, he had believed Susan simply disappeared. For nearly 50 years, he had assumed she left without explanation. But now another possibility stood before him. The letter had been written. The truth had been sent. And somehow, it never arrived. That night, Richard barely slept. Questions chased him through the darkness. Who mailed the letter? Why had he never received it? Had Susan spent years believing he ignored her? Had Emily grown up thinking her father abandoned her? Every answer seemed to create 10 new questions. By morning, he looked exhausted. Still, he got into his car. The diner was 90 minutes away. 90 minutes that felt like a lifetime. Rain clouds covered the highway. His windshield wipers moved back and forth like a metronome marking the years he had lost. 48 years. 48 birthdays. 48 chances to know his daughter. Gone. Not because he chose them to be gone, but gone all the same. And nothing could return them. The diner was nearly empty when Richard arrived. A waitress poured coffee near the counter. Soft country music played overhead. Everything looked ordinary. Yet Richard felt as if his entire life was about to change. He checked his watch. 2:57 p.m. 3 minutes early. He chose a booth near the window. His stomach churned. At exactly 3 p.m., the door opened. A woman stepped inside. Richard looked up and froze. Not because he recognized her, because he recognized Susan. Emily had her mother's eyes. The same smile. The same way of brushing hair behind her ear. For one dizzying moment, it felt like time had folded in on itself. Emily spotted him immediately. She walked slowly toward the booth. Neither spoke. Neither seemed to know how. Then she sat down across from him. The silence stretched between them, 48 years wide. Finally Emily smiled nervously. "Hi," Richard swallowed. "Hi." That single word carried more emotion than either expected. For several minutes, they talked carefully. Small questions. Safe questions. Where do you live? What do you do for work? Do you have children? Emily explained she worked as a nurse. She had been married once. Divorced now. 2 grown sons. Richard listened closely, trying to absorb every detail, trying to catch up on nearly half a century in a single afternoon. Then Emily reached into her purse. She pulled out a photo album. Old, worn, protected carefully for years. "My mother kept this." Richard felt his pulse quicken. Emily opened the first page. Photographs filled the album. Susan, young Emily, school pictures, birthday parties, graduations, a lifetime, page after page. Moments Richard had never seen. Moments he could never get back. His eyes lingered on a photograph of Emily at 6 years old holding a bicycle. Another at 12 wearing braces. Another at 18 in a graduation gown. Every image felt like a tiny heartbreak. Because he should have been there. Not in every picture, but at least some of them. Then Emily turned to a page near the back. There was a photograph Richard had never seen. A picture of Susan sitting on a porch. Older, perhaps in her 50s. Holding a letter in her hands. On the back someone had written a date. Richard frowned. "What's this?" Emily's expression changed. The smile disappeared. The warmth left her eyes. Suddenly she looked nervous. Almost afraid. "My mother spent years trying to find you." Richard blinked. "What?" Emily nodded. After the letter, the words hit like a punch. "What do you mean?" Emily looked down at the table. She thought you ignored her at first. Richard felt sick. But later she started to believe something else happened. His heart raced. What happened? Emily took a long breath. Then she revealed the secret she had carried for months. "My mother found someone who admitted the letter never reached you." Richard stared at her, unable to speak. The diner noise faded into the background. Everything seemed distant, unreal. "Who?" he finally whispered. Emily looked directly into his eyes, and what she said next shattered him. "Your father." The world stopped. Richard's father had been dead for 22 years. A strict man. A controlling man. A man who had never approved of Susan. And now Emily was telling him something impossible. Something horrifying. According to Susan, the letter had reached Richard's house, and his father had intercepted it, hidden it, and never told him it existed. Richard felt the air leave his lungs. Because if it was true, then the greatest loss of his life had not been an accident. Someone had chosen it for him. And Emily wasn't finished. She slowly slid another document across the table. A document that appeared to contain proof. And as Richard reached for it, he realized everything he believed about his family was about to collapse. Richard stared at the document lying on the table. For several seconds, he couldn't bring himself to touch it. His father's name was written across the top. The sight alone made his stomach tighten. Because if Emily was right, then the man who raised him had secretly changed the course of his entire life. And he had taken that secret to his grave. Slowly, Richard picked up the paper. His hands were shaking. The document wasn't a letter. It was a signed statement. A copy of a written confession made years earlier. Emily watched silently as he began to read. The statement came from an elderly neighbor named Walter Jenkins. Richard remembered him immediately. Walter had lived 2 houses away when Richard was young. The man had passed away many years ago. According to the document, Walter had spoken to Susan in the late 1990s. At the time, Susan was still searching for answers. Still trying to understand why Richard never responded. Still wondering why he had seemingly abandoned her. Then Walter told her something he had witnessed decades earlier. Something he had never forgotten. Richard's eyes moved across the page. "I personally handed the envelope to Robert Bennett," Walter had written. Robert Bennett, Richard's father. "He told me Richard was away, and that he would make sure he received it." Richard swallowed hard. The room felt smaller. The words continued. "A few days later, I asked Richard if he got the letter. He looked confused, and said no." Richard's heartbeat quickened. He remembered that conversation. Barely. Just a vague memory. Walter asking about a letter. Richard assuming it was junk mail. Nothing more. At the time, he had thought nothing of it. Now it felt like a knife, twisting deeper. The statement continued. "Later, Robert admitted to me privately that he destroyed it." Richard stopped breathing. Destroyed it. Not misplaced. Not forgotten. Destroyed. Intentionally. Deliberately. Gone forever. He lowered the paper. For a long time, neither he nor Emily spoke. Finally, Richard looked up. His eyes were wet. "I don't understand." Emily nodded slowly. "My mother didn't either." "Why would he do that?" Emily hesitated. "Did your father dislike her?" Richard laughed bitterly. Dislike wasn't the word. His father had hated Susan. He thought she came from the wrong family. Thought she would ruin Richard's future. Thought she wasn't good enough. Back then, Robert Bennett's opinion carried enormous weight. He controlled everything. The household. The money. The decisions. And Richard had spent years trying to earn his approval. Years trying to become the son his father wanted. A son who never seemed good enough. Now, sitting in that diner, Richard realized something painful. Even at 69 years old, part of him was still trying. Emily looked at him carefully. My mother said she stopped looking after that. Richard frowned. What do you mean? Once she learned about the letter, Emily's voice softened. She thought there was no point. Richard stared at her. Why? Because she believed too much time had passed. The answer hurt. Not because it was unreasonable. Because it sounded exactly like something Susan would say. Practical, protective, trying to avoid more pain. Emily continued. She built a life. Richard nodded. So did I. Neither seemed comforted by the fact. They sat together for nearly 3 hours, talking, listening, filling gaps in each other's lives. Richard learned Emily loved gardening, loved old movies, collected antique clocks, small details, ordinary details, yet each one felt precious, because they were things fathers are supposed to know, things he was learning almost 50 years late. At one point, Emily showed him photographs of her sons. His grandsons. The word felt unreal. Grandsons. 2 young men living their lives completely unaware that their grandfather was sitting across from their mother in a roadside diner. Richard stared at the pictures. One had his eyes. The resemblance was impossible to miss. Emily noticed. So did my mother. Richard smiled sadly. What did she say? Emily looked down at the photo. She said every time she looked at me she saw you. The words nearly broke him. When they finally left the diner, the sun was beginning to set. They stood awkwardly beside their cars, unsure how to say goodbye. Neither wanted the day to end. Neither knew what came next. Then Emily surprised him. She stepped forward and hugged him. Richard froze for a second, then slowly wrapped his arms around her. His daughter. The words still felt impossible. His daughter. After 48 years. For the first time all day, he allowed himself to believe it. Not completely, but enough. Enough to feel hope. Enough to feel grief. Enough to feel both at once. That evening, Richard returned home, emotionally exhausted. But something had changed. The house no longer felt quite as empty. For the first time in years, there was a future he wanted to see. People he wanted to know. Time he wanted to make up for. Even if he could never fully recover what was lost. Then he noticed something strange. A small envelope had been slipped under his front door. No stamp. No return address. Nothing. Just his name written on the front. Richard frowned. He was certain it hadn't been there when he left. Slowly he picked it up. Opened it. Inside was a single photograph. Old. Faded. Black and white. Richard stared at it in confusion. Then his heart nearly stopped. The photograph showed Susan. Pregnant. Standing beside a car. But she wasn't alone. Another person stood beside her. A man. A man Richard recognized immediately. Because it wasn't his father. And it wasn't anyone from Susan's family. It was Richard's older brother, Michael. The brother who had died 15 years ago. Attached to the photograph was a handwritten note. Only 6 words. 6 words that changed everything again. Michael knew the truth too. Richard felt a chill run through his body. Because if Michael had known, then this secret had been buried by more than one person. And suddenly Richard realized he might not yet know the whole story. Not even close. Richard didn't sleep that night. The photograph sat on the kitchen table under a lamp. He must have looked at it 100 times. Susan stood beside an old blue sedan, one hand resting on her pregnant belly. And next to her stood Michael, his older brother, smiling, comfortable, as if they knew each other well. Richard rubbed his tired eyes. None of it made sense. For decades he had believed Michael barely knew Susan. They had met a few times, shared a few conversations. Nothing more. At least, that's what Richard thought. Now he wasn't so sure. The handwritten note haunted him. Michael knew the truth too. But who had sent it? And why now? The next morning, Richard called Emily. I need to show you something. An hour later, they met at a small coffee shop. Emily studied the photograph carefully. Her face grew pale. I've never seen this before. You don't recognize where it was taken? She shook her head. No. Richard pointed to Michael. Did your mother ever mention him? Emily hesitated. Then something changed in her expression. A memory. A distant one. Maybe. Richard leaned forward. What do you mean? Emily stared at the picture. When I was little, my mother used to talk about someone named Mike. Richard's pulse quickened. Mike? She nodded. I always assumed he was a friend. Did she ever explain? No. Emily frowned. But I remember one thing. What? My mother trusted him. The words lingered between them. Trusted him. Not a casual acquaintance. Not a stranger. Someone important. Someone involved. That afternoon, Richard drove to the house where Michael had lived before he died. The property belonged to Michael's widow, Diane. They hadn't spoken much in recent years. Not because of any fight. Life had simply pulled them apart. When Diane opened the door, surprise filled her face. Richard? He managed a weak smile. Can we talk? An hour later, they sat in her living room. The photograph rested on the coffee table. Diane stared at it, then sighed. A long, heavy sigh. The kind people release when they're carrying something they no longer want to hold. Richard noticed immediately. You've seen this before. Diane closed her eyes. For several seconds, she said nothing. Then she nodded. Yes. Richard felt his heart pounding. When? Years ago. The answer hit like thunder. Years ago. Not recently. Not by accident. Years. Meaning Michael had kept this secret for decades. Just like their father. Tell me the truth, Richard said quietly. Diane looked away. Tears formed in her eyes. Michael never wanted to hurt you. Richard's stomach tightened. That wasn't a denial. That was confirmation. What did he know? Diane wiped her face. More than he should have. Richard waited. Every second felt endless. Finally she stood and walked toward a closet. From a box on the top shelf, she removed an old notebook. The cover was worn. The pages yellowed. She placed it in front of him. It belonged to Michael. Richard opened it carefully. Inside were journal entries. Dates, thoughts, memories. His brother's handwriting filled every page. Then he found an entry from 1978. The year Emily was born. His hands began to shake as he read. Susan came by again today. Richard swallowed hard. The next lines blurred slightly as emotion flooded through him. She asked if Richard knew. I didn't know what to say. Richard looked up, his chest tightening. Then he continued reading. Dad made me promise not to tell him. The room became silent. Completely silent. Even the ticking clock seemed to disappear. Richard stared at the words. Again and again. Trying to process them. Trying to understand. Trying not to break. Michael had known. His father had known. And both had stayed silent. The journal entry continued. Dad says Susan will ruin Richard's future. Says he's finally building a career. Says a baby will destroy everything. Richard clenched his jaw. The familiar anger was growing. An anger he had never felt toward his father before. Not like this. Not this deeply. Not this personally. He kept reading. I think Dad is wrong. But I don't know how to fix it. The words made Richard pause. For the first time, he saw something else. Fear. Michael hadn't been the powerful older brother he remembered. He had been a young man trapped between loyalty and conscience. Still wrong. Still responsible. But maybe not evil. Just weak. Just afraid. Then Richard reached the final paragraph. The final paragraph changed everything. Susan told me something today. His heartbeat accelerated. She said she isn't leaving because Richard rejected her. She's leaving because she's sick. Richard froze. The sentence didn't make sense. Sick? Susan had never mentioned being sick. Emily had never mentioned it either. He read further. Doctors found a heart condition. She says she doesn't know what the future holds. She doesn't want Richard throwing away his dreams. Because of her. Richard lowered the notebook. His entire body felt numb. This wasn't the story he thought he knew. Not even close. Susan hadn't simply disappeared. She hadn't left out of anger. She hadn't vanished because Richard didn't respond. According to Michael, she had been terrified. Terrified of what might happen to her. Terrified of becoming a burden. Terrified of destroying Richard's future. And she had carried that fear alone. That evening, Richard called Emily. His voice trembled. Your mother had a heart condition. Silence. Then Emily answered. I know. Richard stopped breathing. You knew? Yes. The sadness in her voice was immediate. Painful. Heavy. There was something else she never told you. Richard gripped the phone tighter. His pulse thundered in his ears. What? A long silence followed, long enough to make his stomach drop. Then Emily finally spoke, and the words nearly knocked the breath from his lungs. "My mother didn't spend 50 years believing you abandoned us." Richard closed his eyes. "What are you saying?" Emily's voice broke. "She met you once after she left." The world stopped. Richard couldn't move, couldn't think, couldn't speak, because if that was true, then somewhere in his forgotten past was a meeting he didn't remember, a meeting that could explain everything. And suddenly, the biggest mystery wasn't why Susan disappeared. It was why Richard had no memory of seeing her. Richard sat frozen, with the phone pressed against his ear. Rain tapped softly against the living room window. But he barely heard it. Only one sentence echoed through his mind. "She met you once after she left." It was impossible. Or at least it should have been. Richard remembered countless moments from those years. His first apartment, his first real job, the day he bought his first car, the night he met Margaret. But meeting Susan after she left, meeting the woman carrying his child, that should have been unforgettable. Yet he remembered nothing. Absolutely nothing. "Emily," he whispered. "Are you sure?" "Yes." The answer came immediately, without hesitation, without doubt. "My mother told me herself." Richard slowly sat down. His legs felt weak. When? About a year before she died. The room seemed smaller, the air heavier. Everything was changing again. And every new answer somehow created more questions. Emily arrived at Richard's house later that evening. Neither wanted to discuss something this important over the phone. They sat at the kitchen table, coffee untouched between them. Finally, Emily opened a folder she had brought. "My mother wrote this." Inside was a journal. Not Michael's. Susan's. Richard stared at the familiar handwriting. His chest tightened. After all these years, it felt as though Susan was speaking directly to him. Emily carefully turned to a marked page. Dated October 1978. Richard swallowed. Emily slid the journal across the table. And he began to read. "Today I saw Richard." The words instantly made his heart race. "After months of searching, I finally found him." Richard's hands trembled. Months of searching. Susan had looked for him. She hadn't simply vanished. She had tried. Again and again. The journal continued. "I almost turned around when I saw him. He looked happy, older somehow, like life was already moving forward without me." Richard's eyes blurred. He continued reading. "I told myself not to cry. I told myself to be strong. For the baby." He paused. A lump formed in his throat. The baby, Emily, his daughter, still growing inside her at that moment. Still unknown to him. Then came the part that changed everything. "Richard didn't recognize me at first." Richard frowned. That made no sense. How could he not recognize Susan? He kept reading. "The bandages covered most of my face." Bandages? His eyes widened. The next lines explained. "The surgery was successful. Doctors say my heart should recover. But the complications were worse than expected. I barely recognized myself in the mirror." Richard looked up. Confused. Heart surgery? Complications? Bandages? This was an entirely different story than he had imagined. Emily nodded softly. "My mother had emergency surgery." Richard stared at her. "You never told me that." "I didn't know all the details until recently." Richard looked back at the page, trying to absorb it, trying to understand the life Susan had lived, while he remained completely unaware. Then he reached the paragraph describing the meeting, and suddenly his pulse exploded. When I approached him, he looked frightened, confused, lost. Richard frowned. Lost? The next sentence answered why. He had been drinking. Richard closed his eyes. Pain washed over him, because suddenly, he remembered, not clearly, not completely, just fragments. A bar, a parking lot, a rainy night, a woman speaking to him, a face he couldn't quite place, a conversation he couldn't fully understand. Pieces, broken pieces, but they were there, hidden all these years, waiting. The journal continued. "I asked if we could talk. He said he was late. I told him it was important. He apologized and said he didn't know me." Richard's chest tightened painfully. No, 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 he remembered now. At least part of it. There had been a woman with facial bandages. A woman he genuinely didn't recognize. A woman who approached him unexpectedly outside a bar. At the time, he had assumed she had mistaken him for someone else. He never imagined it was Susan. Tears rolled down his face as he kept reading. For a moment, I considered telling him everything. The baby, the letter, the years, all of it. Richard's breathing became shaky. Then came the line that shattered him. But when I looked into his eyes, I realized he truly didn't know who I was. The journal page blurred. His vision filled with tears. Because Susan had misunderstood. She thought he was rejecting her. Again. She thought he was pretending not to know her. She thought the silence had been intentional. Emily quietly reached across the table, placed her hand over his. Neither spoke. Neither needed to. The pain was obvious. The tragedy was obvious. Two people had spent decades believing lies created by misunderstandings, fear, and silence. And all of it could have been avoided. Then Richard turned to the next page. And everything changed again. The entry had been written 3 days after the meeting. Only 3 days. The handwriting looked rushed, almost frantic. His eyes moved across the page, then stopped. His blood ran cold. Because Susan had written, "Someone visited me after I saw Richard." Richard frowned. Someone? He read further. He warned me to stop searching. The room became silent. Emily's eyes widened. She clearly hadn't read this page before. Richard continued. He said seeing Richard again would only cause pain. He said Richard was finally moving on. He said I needed to let him go. Richard's heartbeat thundered. The next line made his stomach drop. Because Susan had written the visitor's name. And it wasn't his father. It wasn't Michael. It wasn't anyone he expected. It was someone much closer. Someone whose betrayal would cut even deeper. The page read, "The visitor was Margaret." Richard felt the world tilt beneath him. Margaret. His late wife. The woman he had loved for 40 years. The woman he thought he knew completely. And suddenly, a terrifying question appeared in his mind. What exactly had Margaret known about Susan? And when had she known it? Richard stared at the name on the page. Margaret. His wife. The woman he had loved for more than 40 years. The woman he had buried with tears in his eyes 6 years ago. The woman whose photograph still sat beside his bed. For several seconds, he couldn't breathe. The room felt impossibly quiet. Emily looked just as shocked. "You didn't know?" she asked softly. Richard slowly shook his head. "No." His voice barely worked. "No. I swear I didn't." Because he truly didn't. Nothing in Margaret's behavior over 4 decades had ever suggested she knew anything about Susan. Nothing. Yet Susan's journal said otherwise. And Susan had written it only days after their mysterious meeting. Richard looked down and continued reading. Every word felt heavier than the last. Margaret seemed kind. She wasn't cruel. She wasn't angry. She looked scared. Richard frowned. Scared? The journal continued. She said Richard was building a new life. She said he finally seemed happy again. She asked me not to contact him. Richard swallowed hard. His hands tightened around the journal. Why would Margaret do that? At the time, she and Richard weren't even married. According to the dates, they had only been dating a few months. The relationship was still new, still uncertain. Yet somehow Margaret had found Susan. And somehow she knew enough to seek her out. None of it made sense. The next paragraph hurt even more. Margaret told me she loved him. She said she wasn't asking for herself. She said she was asking for him. Richard closed his eyes. The words sounded exactly like Margaret. Gentle, protective, always worried about other people. But if that was true, then why keep the secret? Why never tell him? Why let him spend decades believing Susan had simply vanished? Then he reached the final lines of the entry. And suddenly, everything changed. Before she left, Margaret told me something strange. Richard opened his eyes. The handwriting grew shakier, more emotional. She said she only learned about me because someone else told her. Richard felt his pulse quicken. Someone else? Who? The answer came immediately. She said Richard's father came to see her. The room fell silent. Emily stared at him. Richard stared back. Neither spoke, because the pieces were beginning to fit together. And the picture they created was ugly. Very ugly. Robert Bennett, Richard's father. The man who hid the letter. The man who convinced Michael to stay silent. And apparently, the man who spoke to Margaret. How many lives had he manipulated? How many choices had he influenced? How many years had been stolen because of decisions he made behind closed doors? Richard suddenly felt exhausted. Not angry. Not yet. Just tired. A lifetime tired. The kind of tired that comes from realizing your entire history may be different from the story you've always believed. Emily finally broke the silence. My mother never hated Margaret. Richard looked surprised. She didn't? Emily shook her head. No, that wasn't the answer he expected. My mother actually felt sorry for her. Richard blinked. Sorry. Emily nodded. She believed Margaret was being manipulated too. The statement lingered in the air. Manipulated. Just like Susan. Just like Michael. Just like Richard himself. They spent the next hour reading more of Susan's journal. Most entries focused on ordinary life. Work. Raising Emily. Medical appointments. Financial struggles. Small victories. Everyday moments. But Richard noticed something heartbreaking. Susan almost never wrote about resentment. There was sadness, loneliness, regret, but not bitterness. Again and again, she wrote the same thing. I hope Richard is happy. The words appeared throughout the journal, years apart, repeated dozens of times. Every time Richard saw them, his chest tightened, because he realized something painful. Susan had carried love longer than he had carried anger. Then Emily turned to the final section, the last year of Susan's life. The handwriting looked weaker, more fragile. Age and illness were beginning to show. Richard carefully read the final entries. One page made him stop completely. The date was only 18 months before Susan died. Much more recent than anything else. The entry began. Today I received a letter. Richard frowned. A letter? From whom? His eyes moved lower. Then his heart nearly stopped. Because Susan had written, it was from Margaret. Richard looked up. What? Emily shook her head. I never saw this part. Both of them leaned closer. The journal continued. I hadn't heard from Margaret in decades. I assumed she forgot I existed. I was wrong. Richard's pulse pounded in his ears. Margaret had contacted Susan? After all those years? Why? The answer appeared in the next paragraph. And when Richard read it, tears immediately filled his eyes. Margaret said she was dying. The room blurred. Cancer. The same disease that eventually took her life. Susan's journal continued. She told me she had a secret she could no longer carry. Richard's hands began shaking again. A secret. The truth. Finally, after decades. Then came the sentence that changed everything. The sentence that made Richard lower the journal and stare into empty space. Because Margaret had written to Susan, Richard never knew the truth. Not doesn't know. Never knew. Meaning Margaret believed Richard was innocent. Meaning she knew he never received the letter. Meaning she understood what Robert Bennett had done. And she had carried that knowledge for decades. But there was one final paragraph. One final revelation. And it hit harder than everything before it. Susan had written. Margaret wanted to tell Richard everything. She planned to. But she said there was one thing she couldn't explain. Richard's stomach tightened. What thing? He whispered. Emily quickly turned the page. Both of them froze. Because Susan had copied Margaret's exact words. A direct quote. Only one sentence. One sentence that changed the entire story again. The quote read, There is still someone alive who knows more than either of us. Richard felt cold. Very cold. Because according to Margaret, the biggest secret hadn't died with Robert. Hadn't died with Michael. Hadn't died with Susan. Someone was still alive. Someone who knew the complete truth. And beneath the quote, Susan had written a name. A name Richard hadn't heard in nearly 40 years. A name that made his heart stop. Walter Bennett, his younger brother. The brother who disappeared from the family decades ago. The brother no one had spoken to since 1987. And suddenly Richard realized that if he wanted answers, he would have to find the one person who had spent 40 years running from the past. Richard stared at the name. Walter Bennett. His younger brother. The brother he hadn't seen in nearly 40 years. The brother who had vanished from the family without explanation. The brother everyone eventually stopped talking about. For years, Richard had convinced himself it didn't matter. Families drift apart. People leave. Life happens. But now, for the first time, He wondered if Walter's disappearance had never been about distance at all. Maybe it had been about secrets. The next morning, Richard stood in his attic, surrounded by dusty boxes, old family photographs, letters, tax records, documents nobody had touched in decades. If Walter was still alive, Richard needed to find him. And somehow, after all these years, there was almost no trace left. Then, buried inside an old photo album, he found something. A Christmas card, dated 1994. The return address was from a small town in Montana. Richard's pulse quickened. It wasn't much, but it was a starting point. Over the next week, Richard and Emily worked together. The partnership felt strange at first. Wonderful, but strange. Father and daughter, learning each other while chasing the same mystery. Each phone call felt a little easier. Each conversation lasted a little longer. And with every passing day, Richard found himself caring less about lost years and more about the time they still had. Still, the questions remained. Questions that only Walter could answer. Finally, after days of searching, they found a lead. A nursing facility outside a small Montana town. A man named Walter Bennett was listed as a resident. The age matched. The birthplace matched. Everything matched. Richard stared at the information, his heart racing. After nearly 40 years, he had found his brother. 3 days later, Richard boarded a plane. Emily insisted on coming. Neither wanted him to face this alone. The flight felt endless. As the mountains appeared below, Richard's stomach tightened. What if Walter refused to talk? What if he denied everything? What if the truth was worse than they imagined? By the time they arrived at the nursing facility, Richard felt physically exhausted. A nurse guided them down a quiet hallway. Room 214. She stopped outside the door. "He's awake," she said gently. Richard nodded, then stepped inside. The man sitting by the window looked nothing like the brother he remembered. Age had transformed him. His hair was white, his shoulders thin, his hands frail, but the eyes were unmistakable. Walter looked up. For several seconds, neither man spoke. Then Walter's eyes widened. "Richard." The word barely escaped his lips. Richard swallowed hard. "Hello, Walter." The older man's face crumpled. Not with anger, not with fear, with guilt. Immediate, overwhelming guilt. And in that moment, Richard knew. Walter already understood why he was there. For a long time, nobody spoke. Finally, Walter looked at Emily. His expression changed, softened. Then he whispered something unexpected. "You look like Susan." Emily froze. Richard froze. Walter slowly closed his eyes, as if a burden he had carried for decades was finally catching up with him. "You know who she is," Richard said quietly. Walter nodded. Tears appeared immediately. And that was all the confirmation Richard needed. The conversation that followed was painful. Walter didn't try to hide, didn't try to deny, didn't try to escape. Perhaps he was too old, or perhaps he was simply tired of carrying the truth. "Robert told me everything," Walter admitted. Richard's jaw tightened. "Their father again. Always their father," Walter continued. "He told me about the letter." Richard said nothing. "He told me about Susan." Still silence. "And he told me about the baby." Emily lowered her eyes. The baby, a word that once meant her. A secret child hidden from her own father. Then Walter revealed something Richard never expected. "I argued with him." Richard blinked. "What?" Walter nodded. "I fought him." The older man's voice trembled. More than once. Richard stared, because nobody had ever stood up to Robert Bennett. Nobody. Not Michael. Not Richard. Not even their mother. Yet Walter claimed he had. Walter slowly reached toward a drawer beside his bed. His hands shook badly. Inside was an old envelope, yellow with age, protected carefully for decades. He handed it to Richard. "Open it." Richard looked confused, then carefully removed the contents. A photograph fell into his lap. His breath caught. It showed Susan holding a newborn baby. Emily, only weeks old. Written on the back was a short note. For Richard. If he ever learns the truth. Richard couldn't speak. Tears blurred his vision. He had never seen his daughter as a baby. Never held her. Never rocked her to sleep. Never heard her first words. And now all he had was a photograph. 48 years too late. Then Walter said something that changed everything again. Something none of them expected. "I wasn't the one who kept the truth from you." Richard looked up sharply. "What?" Walter nodded toward the envelope. There was another letter. The room became silent. Another letter? Richard's heart pounded. Susan had written again? Walter shook his head. "No." His voice cracked. "The second letter came from your mother." Richard froze. His mother? The gentle woman who spent her life avoiding conflict? The woman who rarely challenged anyone? Walter slowly nodded. And then he revealed the secret he had carried for nearly 40 years. A secret so shocking that even he struggled to say it aloud. Because according to Walter, Richard's mother had discovered everything. The letter, the pregnancy, the lies, all of it. And shortly before she died, she left behind a message. A message intended for Richard. A message nobody ever delivered. Walter's trembling hands moved toward a locked box beneath his bed. And as he reached for the key, Richard realized the final answers had been waiting all along. Hidden not by strangers, not by enemies, but by his own family. Walter's hands trembled as he unlocked the small wooden box. The room was silent. Richard could hear nothing, except the sound of his own heartbeat. 48 years. 48 years of questions. 48 years of missing pieces. And now, somehow, the answers were sitting inside a box, at the foot of an old man's bed. Walter lifted the lid. Inside were only a few items. A faded photograph, several yellowed documents, and one sealed envelope. Across the front, written in careful handwriting, were 4 words. "For my son Richard." Richard immediately recognized the handwriting. His mother's. His throat tightened. She had died in 1988, nearly 4 decades ago. And yet somehow her voice was about to return. Walter handed him the envelope. Neither man spoke. Neither needed to. Slowly Richard broke the seal. Inside was a letter. Only 3 pages. But before he even read the first line, tears filled his eyes. Because he suddenly realized something heartbreaking. His mother had known. All these years, she had known. He began reading. "My dear Richard, if you are reading this, then I failed." Richard's vision blurred. "I prayed I would find the courage to tell you myself. But I am running out of time." Cancer. His mother had died of cancer. The same disease that later took Margaret. Life had strange ways of repeating itself. Richard continued. "There is something you deserve to know. Something I should have told you years ago." The words felt heavier with every line. Then came the truth. The truth she had carried until her final days. "Your father intercepted Susan's letter." Richard closed his eyes. Even though he already knew, seeing it confirmed by his mother hurt in a different way. A deeper way. A final way. The letter continued. "When I discovered what he had done, I was furious." Richard almost smiled through his tears. His mother had rarely shown anger. Yet for this, she had. And suddenly he could picture it. The quiet woman finally standing up to the man who controlled everything. Finally refusing to stay silent. The image filled him with unexpected pride. Then he reached a paragraph that made him stop. "I tried to contact Susan." Richard looked up. "What?" Walter nodded. "I told you." Richard returned to the page, his hands shaking. "I found her address. I wrote her twice. I begged her to speak with you." Emily's eyes widened. Neither of them had known this. Neither had Susan. Apparently the letters never reached her. Another cruel twist. Another missed connection. Another opportunity stolen by circumstance. Then came the most important part. The reason his mother had written the letter. The reason she had hidden it with Walter. The reason she had carried guilt until the end of her life. "Richard, I need you to understand something. Your father was wrong. Terribly wrong." Richard swallowed hard. The next sentence shattered him. "And so was I." He stared, confused. Then he read further. "I knew the truth for 6 years before I acted." The words hit him like a punch. 6 years. His mother had known for 6 years, and stayed silent. Not forever, but long enough. Long enough for damage to become permanent. The letter continued. "Fear makes cowards of good people. I spent years convincing myself I was protecting the family. In reality, I was protecting myself." Richard felt tears running down his face. Because it wasn't an excuse. It wasn't a defense. It was an admission. An honest one. Perhaps the first completely honest thing anyone in the family had ever said. Then came the final page. The final message. The part written shortly before her death. The handwriting looked weaker, more fragile, but the words remained clear. If life gives you another chance. Richard's hands tightened. Take it. His vision blurred again. Don't waste time being angry. Don't waste time counting what was stolen. Count what remains. The room was completely silent. Even Walter was crying now. Then Richard read the final paragraph. The last words his mother ever wrote to him. Words that would stay with him forever. If Susan is still alive, find her. If the child is alive, love them. If forgiveness is possible, choose it. Because regret grows heavier every year. And one day you wake up and discover there isn't much time left. Richard lowered the letter. The room disappeared behind a wall of tears. Because Susan was gone, he could never find her. Never tell her the things he wished he had said. Never give her the life she deserved. That chance was gone forever. But not everything was gone. Not everything. Slowly Richard looked toward Emily, his daughter. His real daughter. Not a memory. Not a photograph. Not a regret. A living person sitting only a few feet away. Someone he could still know. Someone he could still love. Someone who was still here. And suddenly his mother's words made perfect sense. Count what remains. Not what was stolen. Not what was lost. What remained. 3 months later, Richard sat beneath a large oak tree in a public park. Sunlight filtered through the leaves. Children played nearby. Families laughed. Life moved forward. As it always did. Emily sat beside him. So did her 2 sons. His grandsons. The first time they had all gathered together. One grandson was telling a story. The other was laughing. And Richard found himself laughing too. Really laughing. For the first time in years. Maybe decades. The pain hadn't disappeared. The regrets hadn't vanished. They never would. Some wounds become part of who we are. But they no longer controlled him. Because he had finally learned something that took nearly 70 years to understand. The most important chapter of your life is not the one behind you. It's the one you still have time to write. As the sun began to set, Emily gently rested her head on his shoulder. Neither spoke. Neither needed to. The silence felt peaceful, healing, complete. Richard looked toward the horizon and smiled. Not because the past had been fixed, because the future had finally begun. And for the first time in nearly 50 years, he was no longer living with what he had lost. He was living with what he had found. Life lesson. You cannot change the years that were taken from you. You cannot rewrite yesterday. But if life offers you a second chance, no matter how late it arrives, have the courage to accept it. The weight of regret is heavy, but the gift of forgiveness is stronger.